A doctor in Ohio poisoned coworkers before he ever touched a patient and kept practicing anyway. A Philadelphia abortion provider was convicted of murdering infants born alive. A Texas neurosurgeon was so dangerous in the operating room that colleagues nicknamed him Dr. Death before prosecutors ever built a case. And in Michigan, an Olympic team doctor abused hundreds of young athletes under the cover of medical treatment. 7 doctors, 5 states. This is Case Files. Every case in this episode ended in a verdict, 6 convictions, and 1 acquittal we'll examine just as carefully, because a not guilty verdict is part of the record too. All facts here come from court documents, Department of Justice records, and official case filings. Welcome to Official Verdict Room. Case 1, the doctor who poisoned his own co-workers, Michael Swango, Ohio. It started not in a hospital room, but in an ambulance station in Quincy, Illinois, where a young paramedic named Michael Swango was already poisoning the coworkers around him. Arsenic slipped into food and coffee, coworkers falling mysteriously ill. He served time for that, 5 years for aggravated battery. But the story that matters most begins in Columbus, Ohio, at Ohio State University Hospital, where Swango worked as a medical intern in the early 1980s. Nurses noticed something disturbing. Healthy patients kept dying, and Swango was reliably the one on duty when it happened. One nurse witnessed him injecting a patient who then became suddenly, inexplicably ill. When staff raised the alarm, hospital administrators dismissed the concerns as paranoia. The internal investigation, later called far too superficial by a university dean, cleared him. Ohio State simply declined to bring him back for a second year. That should have ended his medical career. It didn't. Using forged documents, Swango secured a residency in South Dakota, where more patients died before his past caught up with him again. He was fired, then hired again, this time at a psychiatric residency at Stony Brook University in New York, assigned to a Veterans Affairs hospital in Northport. It was there, in 1993, that Swango injected 3 patients with toxic substances, later telling hospital staff in 2 of the cases that the families had requested to not resuscitate orders. He fled the country when investigators closed in, working in Zimbabwe, where authorities suspect he poisoned patients there too, before he was finally arrested at Chicago's O'Hare Airport in 1997. Swango eventually pleaded guilty to 4 murders, though investigators believe his true victim count may run as high as 60, spanning 2 continents and more than a decade of hospitals that kept hiring him. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without parole and remains at the country's only federal supermax penitentiary. Later, in Ohio's own courts, he pleaded guilty to the 1984 murder of 19-year-old patient Cynthia Ann McGee, admitting he had injected her with a fatal dose of potassium during his internship, the case that started it all, finally closed decades later. Case 2. The abortion doctor and the verdict that divided a country, Kermit, Gosnell, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In West Philadelphia, Dr. Kermit Gosnell operated a women's medical clinic for decades before investigators uncovered what was happening inside it. A raid connected to an unrelated drug investigation exposed conditions and practices that led to a far larger criminal case. Prosecutors charged Gosnell with the murders of infants who prosecutors alleged were born alive during late-term abortion procedures and then killed. They also charged him in connection with the death of an adult patient who died from an overdose of sedatives administered during a procedure at his clinic. The trial became one of the most closely watched medical criminal cases in recent American history, drawing national attention to abortion regulation and clinic oversight on both sides of that broader political debate. In May of 2013, a jury convicted Gosnell of first-degree murder in the deaths of 3 infants and involuntary manslaughter in the death of the adult patient. He was acquitted on 1 additional infant murder charge. Gosnell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Case 3, the prescriptions that became a murder case, H.S.I.U. Ying Lisa Tseng, Los Angeles, California. Dr. Lisa Tseng ran a private practice in the Los Angeles area, and for years, prosecutors say she wrote prescriptions for powerful opioid painkillers with little to no medical examination behind them. Patients came in seeking specific drugs by name. According to trial testimony, she gave them what they asked for, in quantities prosecutors described in court as far beyond any legitimate medical purpose. A dozen of Tseng's patients died from overdoses during the period prosecutors investigated. Homicide charges against a doctor for prescribing practices were, at the time, exceptionally rare in the United States. Prosecutors ultimately brought murder charges tied to 3 of those deaths, where the evidence most clearly excluded other contributing factors. In October of 2015, a jury convicted Tseng of second-degree murder, the first such conviction of a U.S. doctor for reckless prescribing. She was also convicted of illegally writing prescriptions, including to undercover agents investigating her practice. Deputy District Attorney John Niederman told reporters after the verdict that a white coat does not put a doctor above the law. Tseng was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years to life, depending on the specific term applied to her sentence. Case 4. The surgeon they called Dr. Death, Christopher Duntsch, Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas. Christopher Duntsch arrived in the Dallas-Fort Worth area presenting an impressive resume, advanced neurosurgical training, published research, expertise in minimally invasive spine surgery. Hospitals took him at his word. Between 2011 and 2013, prosecutors say, Duntsch performed spinal surgery so poorly executed that colleagues who assisted him described his skill as comparable to a first-year medical student's. Of the patients he operated on during this window, 33 were harmed, 2 died. Others were left paralyzed or permanently disabled, including a close childhood friend who had trusted him specifically because of their history together. What made the case unusual wasn't just the harm, it was how long it took to stop him. Hospital officials and state regulators, according to later reporting and testimony, found it difficult to believe a licensed surgeon could be performing this poorly, and Duntsch was allowed to continue operating, moving between facilities even as reports of harm accumulated. It was ultimately a group of fellow physicians who pushed for his prosecution, providing expert testimony that helped build the case against him. Duntsch was indicted on charges including injury to an elderly patient, tied specifically to the case of Mary Eford, a woman who lost a significant portion of her blood and the full use of her legs during a procedure with him. In February of 2017, a Dallas County jury convicted him. He was sentenced to life in prison, the first surgeon in the United States convicted of a crime committed during the act of surgery itself. His license had already been revoked by the Texas Medical Board in 2013. Case 5. The cancer that wasn't there, Farid, Fata, Metro, Detroit, Michigan. Dr. Farid Fata built one of the largest private cancer treatment networks in Michigan, operating 7 clinics under the name Michigan Hematology Oncology across the Detroit suburbs. Patients came to him trusting a cancer diagnosis and a treatment plan meant to save their lives. According to federal prosecutors, hundreds of those diagnoses were never real. Fata administered aggressive chemotherapy, iron infusions, and other treatments to 553 patients who did not have cancer or who did not need the treatments he was billing for. Some patients later learned they had endured months of toxic treatment for a disease they never had. The scheme generated approximately $225 million in fraudulent claims submitted to Medicare over 6 years. The case first drew attention in 2010 when an oncology nurse considering a job with Fata's practice observed what she later described publicly as a chemo mill, far more patients receiving infusions at once than standard practice would allow. It took years more before federal investigators built a full case In September of 2014, Fata pleaded guilty to 13 counts of healthcare fraud, 1 count of conspiracy to pay and receive kickbacks, and 2 counts of money laundering. In July of 2015, he was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison and ordered to forfeit over $17 million. Assistant Attorney General Leslie Caldwell said at sentencing that rather than using his medical degree to save lives, Fata had instead used it to destroy them in pursuit of profit. Case 6, the team doctor Larry Nassar, Lansing, Michigan. For roughly 2 decades, Larry Nassar worked as a sports medicine physician for Michigan State University and USA Gymnastics, treating some of the country's top young athletes, including Olympic gymnasts. Beginning in 2016, more than 260 women and girls came forward with accounts of sexual abuse committed by Nassar under the guise of legitimate medical treatment, spanning back decades. Many of the patients involved were minors at the time of the abuse. In keeping with standard reporting practice for cases involving minor victims, this account states only that abuse occurred and that it was prosecuted, without further detail. Nassar pleaded guilty to 7 counts of criminal sexual conduct in Ingham County, Michigan, and separately to federal child pornography charges. In January of 2018, Ingham County Circuit Judge Rosemarie Aquilina sentenced him to 40 to 175 years in prison, telling him directly in court that she had signed his death warrant. A second Michigan sentencing in Eaton County added a further 40 to 125 years. He had already received a 60-year federal sentence for the child pornography charges. Nassar will spend the remainder of his life in prison. The case triggered a wider reckoning. The entire USA Gymnastics Board resigned, as did Michigan State's president and athletic director, following findings that both organizations had received warnings about Nassar for years without acting on them. Case 7, the trial that ended in not guilty William Husel, Columbus, Ohio. Not every case in this episode ends in conviction, and this one is worth including specifically because it didn't. William Husel worked as an intensive care physician at Mount Carmel Health System's hospitals in Columbus, Ohio. Between 2015 and 2018, prosecutors alleged, he ordered unusually high doses of fentanyl for critically ill patients in some instances, 500 micrograms or more, doses that expert witnesses for the prosecution testified could not serve any legitimate medical purpose. In 2019, Husel was indicted on 25 counts of murder. Prosecutors later narrowed the case to 14 counts. Husel's defense argued something different, that these were dying patients, and that he was providing comfort care, not attempting to end their lives, in situations where death was already imminent regardless of the medication administered. The trial ran roughly 2 months, with 53 prosecution witnesses, including family members of all 14 patients named in the case. On the 20th of April 2022, after nearly 2 months of testimony and roughly a week of jury deliberation, Husel was found not guilty on all 14 counts of murder. He voluntarily surrendered his medical license following the acquittal. The case didn't end there. Husel later sued Mount Carmel and its parent company, Trinity Health, for defamation, alleging the hospital system's public statements during the investigation had destroyed his career before he was ever tried. In June of 2025, a Franklin County judge dismissed that case before it reached the jury, ruling Husel hadn't presented enough evidence to support the claim. As of this recording, Husel maintains that the stigma from the case has followed him regardless of the acquittal, a reminder that, in criminal law, not guilty and cleared in the court of public opinion are not always the same thing. 7 doctors, 5 states, 6 convictions, ranging from federal fraud to first-degree murder, and 1 full acquittal that still reshaped a hospital system and a medical career. Every case here reached its legal conclusion, nothing pending, nothing still unfolding. That's what separates this file from the last one, and it's worth remembering. The presumption of innocence isn't just a legal formality. In at least one of these 7 cases, it's exactly what happened. If a case like this belongs in your feed, that's what Official Verdict Room does. Real cases, real outcomes, sourced and verified. Like this video, tell us which case surprised you most, and subscribe for the next file.